Hi, so we are going to get started and underway. We have just a few brief welcoming remarks so other people can join in, and then we'll get underway. So this is the Breaking Down Silos, Integrating Water into Land Use Planning webinar. It's a three-part series. A few weeks ago on September 13th, we actually hosted the first of the webinars, and this is webinar 2, getting into some more details from that first webinar regarding integrating water into the comprehensive plan. So that's what we'll be spending our time on today for the next hour. My name's Tiffany Zazula. I'm with the Land Use Law Center, who helped develop the webinar series and has been working closely with local officials in Colorado for the past few years. I'd like to thank the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, the APA, and some of our other sponsors you see here at the bottom of your screen for their assistance and support in the development of this webinar. Today you'll be hearing from Professor John Nolan from the Land Use Law Center at Pace Law School. And you'll also hear from Matt Cummins, the planning manager from the City of Westminster in Colorado. We will get going in the next few seconds. I'm going to turn it over to John to get us going. And at the end, what we will do is take questions and answers the last 15 minutes of the webinar. And you can just go ahead, and there is an IM box that you can instant message us your questions either throughout the presentation or during at least that last 15 minutes of Q&A, and we will answer questions during that time. And secondly, for those of you that were not able to use the webinar system, again, we apologize. Hopefully you are following along by phone, and then you can, hopefully you received the PDF of the PowerPoint and can just follow along with the presenters today. And on that note, I think I will turn that over to John.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. I'd like to add a little bit more to what Tiffany said about how we got involved. We were contacted by Western Resource Advocates to conduct some research on the integration of land use and water conservation planning, with the idea that we could develop a curriculum and train local officials on what we found out. When we did our research, we were quite surprised to find very little innovation in this area, very few best practices. We started to work, we began to find some around the country. We worked closely with folks in Colorado to come up with best practices, many of which we'll talk about today. And we learned that this is very much a cutting-edge issue, a process that's under construction, and that we all have a very steep learning curve. So we're happy that we have information from the work that we've done and the considerable input that we've had from local officials in 10 Front Range communities in Colorado to explain what we've come up with regard to integrating water planning into comprehensive land use planning. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Let me explain briefly how the land use system in Colorado works. The local governments in Colorado, just like most states, are not sovereign. They have no inherent power, zero. All of their authority is conveyed to them, delegated to them by the state. So with respect to land use planning, the approach is that local governments are authorized to adopt comprehensive land use plans, sometimes called master plans, that establishes a community vision. It can be somewhat specific, it can be somewhat general, there's a lot of variation. But the important thing is that zoning, which controls what happens on the land and how much is conserved and how much is developed, must conform to the comprehensive plans. The comprehensive plan is extraordinarily important. What we've learned as we've done our research and training in Colorado over the last 4 years is that the comprehensive plan can focus on water conservation very, very specifically, setting the stage for implementation of best practices through zoning and other land use regulations. Adopting a comprehensive plan is important for a small p political reason in that it provides a terrific opportunity to develop strategies for water conservation by bringing water conservation experts and planners and stakeholders together with land use experts and planners and stakeholders to reason together how the comprehensive plan can really encompass water conservation and water protection. So amending the local comprehensive plan allows localities to think of and select land use types, housing settlement practices, best practices of other kinds that are more water conserving, and then to incorporate them into binding regulations. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. The overview of the comprehensive plan is that it generally contains long-term goals, short-term objectives, some strategies to achieve each objective. Each objective is aimed toward the long-term goal, and some implementation techniques that explain how strategies are going to be achieved. And those implementation techniques are best practices. They are adopted by local planning commissions, that is the comprehensive plan in Colorado. Local legislative bodies can be asked to affirm those comprehensive plans, but the commissions adopt and amend the comprehensive plan, and most Colorado communities are required to adopt such a plan. And again, they're advisory and visionary, and in most cases they do not regulate directly. They basically guide the creation of regulations that carry out their objectives. So since zoning, which determines land use types and densities, has to conform to the plan under law, the plan will have a critical effect on future water use. The Colorado law has this to say about the comprehensive plan. It is for the purpose of, quote, guiding and accomplishing a coordinated, adjusted, and harmonious development of the municipality and its environs, which will, in accordance with present and future needs, best promote the health, safety, order, convenience, prosperity, and general welfare of the citizens. Note how broad this purpose is. This emphasizes again the importance of the plan. Next slide. So the critical point for us today is that for the comprehensive plan to support water conservation, it must contain water conserving objectives. The comprehensive plan should contain zoning and land use strategies to achieve those objectives. Such strategies can reduce per capita per day water consumption from over 200 gallons per day to under 100 gallons per day per capita if they're done appropriately and strategically. Water providers and experts are a necessary component of this comprehensive planning, particularly in a water scarce, rapidly growing state like Colorado. Next slide. In order to coordinate water and land use planning, we need a step-by-step understanding of the amendment of the comprehensive plan, of how to identify the planning staff and stakeholders needed to collaborate and converse with water staff and stakeholders who need to be identified and involved, and of integrating inputs throughout the process of amending the comprehensive plan so that these two critical areas of concern are reflected. There are very, very few limitations on what the process of amending a comprehensive plan must be, so there is no difficulty setting up a strategic process that ensures that water planners and stakeholders are involved throughout the process. When the water agency is a municipal entity within the city or county that's doing the land use planning, it's a lot easier and more straightforward to get the water staff involved in land use planning goals and objectives and strategies. But when the community is working with outside water districts and suppliers, more work will need to be done to identify the proper staff and leaders of the water district and seeing that the process accommodates our schedules and time limitations. Next slide. Comprehensive plans focus on infrastructure, and we know how important infrastructure is to water planners. So what land use planners need to know is, from water planners, is what that water infrastructure looks like, what it needs to be, and obvious their extensive involvement in infrastructure issues is critical. Next slide. So how to include water provisions in the comprehensive plan? There are three different approaches here that I'll talk about in a minute because they come up in a case study. One is to put a discrete water element in the comprehensive plan. When we started doing research on this topic, we didn't find very many of those. It's not a traditional element of the comprehensive plan, but that has become one very strategic approach to just get everybody together to think about how you can take advantage of planning on both sides of the aisle and develop a single water element that has everything, all goals, objectives, strategies, implementation techniques in it. Or the more usual and traditional approach is to add water conservation provisions throughout the plan. So you look at the other elements of the comprehensive plan and say, which of these need water components, water strategies, water implementation techniques, or some communities do both. Next slide. Here's an example of a provision that might come out of this collaboration, a water conservation overlay zone. With the input of water planners and stakeholders, the comprehensive plan can identify and designate overlay areas where water conservation is critical. The plan can call for the adoption of a water conservation zone or multiple zones with specific regulation that limit water consumption and water pollution within those zones, so that not all parts of the community are affected by this type of planning, but rather those areas that are most critical to accomplishing conservation goals. This adds to the traditional zoning and site plan regulations and allows more specific emphasis on water conservation than traditionally those regulations allow. Next slide. In San Jose back in 2011, they adopted a comprehensive called Envision San Jose 2040. And what that plan did, we were happy to find out, is clearly define growth areas and areas for conservation. This is sort of the most basic definition of smart growth. Tell us where you want to grow, tell us where you want to conserve. And that's what San Jose did. This strategy strongly emphasizes land use types that are more water conserving. New development in this plan is emphasized in growth areas and is to create mixed-use walkable places. Cluster development is called for. Environmental impact analysis is called for in the conservation areas. New development in conservation areas is not to require significant increases in infrastructure. The goal here is to double water use reductions by 2040. The plan specifically states it wants to reduce per capita consumption by 25%, achieving 50 million gallons per day water savings, again, by 2040. Next slide. The San Jose plan is a hybrid. It contains a standalone water component. It's called Water Supply Conservation, Recycling, and Quality, but it also incorporates water conservation methods, best practices in other chapters of the plan, such as future land uses or environmental quality or urban form. And some of the implementation techniques that can go in those components include water efficient landscaping, increasing groundwater infiltration, requiring low impact development, etc. Next slide. So there's a couple of takeaways here. The first is just what I've already stated. So to repeat, land use plans can follow one of three patterns, and you see those in front of you. And second, the takeaway here is that they can be very specific about implementation techniques and objectives. So we get to the understanding at this point in this presentation that these kinds of specific best practices do belong in, can reside comfortably in, in fact probably should be in comprehensive plans. So this sets the stage for real implementation through zoning and other land use regulations. Next slide. So let's turn to goals which are long-term and objectives which are short-term. The plan should contain data indicating current per capita water consumption. And you saw that in the San Jose case study. They knew what their data was and they knew what it would mean to increase water conservation by a goal, a longer term goal, 2040. They did articulate a goal, 50% savings. One objective is to plan for new development in defined growth areas, as they did to accomplish this goal. Another objective is to call for water conservation through landscaping practices and fixtures that are less water consumptive. So you can see how these can be articulated into goals and objectives. So these three categories are important to take a look at and carry away from this presentation. There are best practice categories that, one, affect land use patterns, two, affect landscaping practices, including exterior fixtures, and then those that affect interior fixtures. And in the work that we did, although there's no definitive study on this, the per capita savings that I mentioned earlier of 100 gallons per day per capita of less consumption, about 50% of that can be derived by changing land use patterns, and about 50% of it through changing landscape regulations and having water smart interior fixtures and that type of thing. Next slide. So let's take a look at best practices that affect land use patterns. These include compact mixed-use development, higher density development, single-family homes with smaller lots, clustered residential subdivisions, multifamily housing, infill development. These are traditional land use planning that is in a different suit of clothes. Here it has an urgent new focus, envisioning and realizing a new pattern of growth to avoid the prospect of no growth in the future because of water limitations. Next slide. So additional practices include innovative zoning techniques such as floating and overlay zoning or bonus density zoning and green infrastructure. So now I'm going to, next slide please, I'm going to run through very quickly what we found in some of the communities where we worked, some of which were adopted while we were working there, and other parts of the country that align with what I just said. Castle Rock, Colorado's plan calls for high-density development in interchange district. This again moves in the direction of changing settlement patterns that are much more water conserving. Aurora's plan does the same thing, integrating water conservation in its building urban activity center section of its comprehensive plan, which requires less water and less energy. Next slide. Chico, California has a general plan that includes a goal, quote, to conserve water resources and improve water quality. And as an action to support this goal, it calls for avoiding impacts to groundwater recharge areas through clustering of development. Larimer County plan calls for smaller lot sizes by requiring 80% open space preservation achieved also through clustering. Next slide. In Colorado Springs, they have a land use chapter in their plan that calls for infill development, which acknowledge their efficient use of public infrastructure, including water and wastewater, and the reduction of per capita consumption of water. In Aurora, again, the plan calls for infill development to create neighborhood livability and allowing the phased extension of existing water lines, cost-effective way to do that. Next slide. Southern California's Association of Governments model plan calls for greater emphasis on multifamily housing to help reduce per capita water consumption. Aurora's plan again calls for green infrastructure, including tree planting, xeriscaping, and community gardens. And next slide, this kind of takes us into the area of landscaping best practices. Identifying landscaping practices that can go into water plans that eventually will find their way into land use regulations include xeriscaping, soil quality and turf requirements, allowable plants that are water conserving, tree size requirements, irrigation system efficiency requirements, and water loss limits. And then the last landscaping slide focuses on irrigation system efficiency requirements, rain sensors, water harvesting, fixture efficiency standards, and positive shutoffs. Now, these are very well-known practices to water planners, to most water planners in most water districts, but relatively unknown to land use planners. So if you come to my last slide, water conservation best practices. One more slide. There you go. This is a chart that we developed. Mac was there. Who's coming up next? Mac Cummins from Westminster was there when we developed this. This was a little exercise that we did that was completely blank when we started. All we did was say, let's identify some traditional land use techniques that can promote water conservation. And let's identify some equipment techniques that can do that, and some land use techniques that can do that, landscaping techniques that can do that. And then let's identify which of those belong in the comprehensive plan, given what I've talked about with respect to goals, objectives, strategies, best practice implementation techniques. And look what the group did. Water and land use planners working together agreed that all of them belong in the comprehensive plan. They all should be mentioned in the comprehensive plan. And then some should be carried out through zoning, some through subdivision regulations, some through site plan regulation, others through building or plumbing code amendments. Now, this is an icon. Notice how all land use equipment and landscaping strategies can go into the comprehensive plan. Notice, too, how each one can be implemented in one of several land use categories, and these can be mentioned in the comprehensive plan as implementation techniques, zoning, subdivision regulations, site plan regulations, and building and plumbing codes. And this really is the subject of our next webinar, which we hope you'll tune in for, where we talk about these implementation techniques in much more detail. So if I could now turn it over to one of the wisest and most experienced members of our training group out in Colorado, let me reintroduce Mac Cummins from Westminster and have him take over the slideshow now.
Well, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm looking forward to talking about this. I think it's a really interesting topic, and what I think is particularly interesting is the amount of individuals that are now joining this dialogue, and a number of professionals in and around the state of Colorado. I don't know how many of you were all at the National Planning Conference down in Phoenix, but I spent about 6 years down there prior to coming up here, and I ran into some old folks, and there were some presentations they were doing after John and Tiffany and I did one on this kind of program. And the state of Colorado is actually a long way ahead of other states in terms of the public dialogue, what's going on relative to this issue of tremendous growth in the West in places where water is a scarce resource. And the dialogue is now starting to turn as water becomes a more precious commodity in the development cycle and the cost of development. And the thing that I have been most struck with is how few times local municipalities, land planners, and water planners are actually getting together to talk at both a policy level and a technical level. And I think we are ahead of the curve. I think most of the folks involved in this are now realizing this is a really big issue, and we need to start, getting together a lot more frequently than we used to. But I still think we've got some work to do. So I'm going to try to give you a walkthrough of what we've done at City of Westminster. We've learned a lot of lessons, some of which have been really good, some of which have been, not so good. But personally now, being in a state with more in-migration than job growth and seeing the continued battery of investment wanting to see residential at high water usage, sometimes in very inefficient growth patterns, I think more than ever, maybe in the history of this state, now is the time that we should be having this kind of dialogue. So why don't you give me the next slide? City of Westminster is a full-service city. I should start with that. So we have our own water utility that is administered in-house. That obviously allows for some things that might not be allowed for if you had an outside water district or a separate water utility. I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit more as we go through, and certainly through the Q&A. We adopt in our zoning and entitlement legislation everything through our comprehensive plan. John touched on some of the more philosophical parts of why the relationship of land use and water use should be addressed in a comprehensive plan. I'm going to try to walk through a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of how that can be accomplished, and maybe a little bit more importantly, why it should be accomplished. City of Westminster has actually set out very audacious urban growth desires. Our city council wants to and is very much moving towards wanting to become the next urban center along the Front Range. And in order to accomplish that, they imagine live, work, and play environments and significant density that was never contemplated over the decades of development up till this point. And so what that has spurred is a significant and robust dialogue between the city planning department that I manage and the city water resources department and utility fund that several of our staff over in Public Works manage. And that dialogue over the last probably 24 to 36 months has led to significant discussions about what would be necessary to achieve the city's vision and or the land plan. And we've learned a lot of lessons about why that is really important dialogue. If for no other reason, then there are city capital improvement projects that need to be accounted for, and the city's land use and vision plan has to be reflective of the ability to provide necessary infrastructure. So why don't you give me the next slide? So we have actually tried to put this down in training programs in several different areas, and John mentioned this a little bit. I'll give you a little bit of a snippet. Some of these things that you see on this list will be the subject of our next webinar. So as a little bit of a teaser, we will be giving you very specific things that you can do with landscape codes and inspections and audits and how we deal with the pricing of water tap fees and that sort of thing to tie all of our economic development and land use planning back into our water supply planning. Today we're going to focus mostly on the policy issues and what should be in a comprehensive plan and why and how we go about even having that dialogue here at City of Westminster. So the first item on that list is consistent coordination and communication. I can't stress this enough. From what we have learned, communication needs to occur on multiple levels to really be successful at getting to a good place, and good place meaning having effective implementation tools and techniques to be efficient in water use and distribution of that water throughout your local municipality or county. We accomplish that through multiple levels. We have routine meetings to talk about policy and changes in land use vision and changes in city council and where they would like to go. So as we imagine urbanizing and becoming more of a live, work, play kind of environment, there's policy dialogue that occurs at least once or twice a month between myself and Director of Public Works, Water Resources Manager, and so forth, to be able to talk about if-then scenarios. If we are interested in densifying in this part of town, is that possible or not? What would it take? How would we acquire more water rights? Is that even possible anymore? We're getting to the point that we may not be able to buy our way into our vision in terms of acquiring more senior water rights to be able to accomplish some of these things. And then how are we going to communicate those big picture messages both downward to the technical staff and then upward to our elected officials, city manager's office, and so forth. The second set of communication that we not only encourage but require is at a technical level. We have landscape architects, land planners, water resources folks that do all our auditing and inspections processes, and we force them to get together. I don't say force because I think everyone in Westminster really gets along. We have them all get together at least twice a month to go through what are the issues of the day, what's coming up out in the field, should we be changing our standard specs, should we be considering policy changes to landscape codes and audit procedures, inspection procedures, and so forth. What kind of surety we require bonding for implementation of our water saving techniques in our landscape code out in the field before you can get an occupancy permit and so forth. So that communication occurs. So two types, one at the policy level, one at the technical level, and then we all circle back together to make sure we're all on the same page. So if I leave you with one indelible thought, make sure you are all communicating in an effective manner to be able to get the issues that are prevalent wherever you are in your community out on the table so that you can actually start, working through those. And then I'll skip through some of this because we'll get into some technical detail on the next webinar, but jumping down to the bottom, the comprehensive plan and the comprehensive water supply plan, or whatever you call those documents in your locale, are absolutely critical that they speak to each other and interact and interrelate with each other. And by that, what I mean is it's amazing as we've gone out and done some of these trainings, and it's okay to admit if you're in this situation, sometimes municipalities will overzone and actually entitle more density and land use than your water supply plan currently allows for. And even just going through the analysis of identifying that and then figuring out what to do with it will absolutely be one of the best things you can do as you work through these issues moving forward before you find out that there's a problem and politically you need to be approving development projects that you don't have infrastructure service for. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we make those decisions and make sure that our elected officials are kept in the loop every step of the way. So give me the next slide. So this is a slide that we show quite a bit, both with our elected officials and really technically when we do trainings like this. We don't have any issues with water supply being a NIMBY issue or somehow out in the community. Mostly what we have found is this is an education effort. Most folks that get into land planning or sit on planning commissions or city councils, we have found don't realize that there's a necessary relationship between changing your land plan or setting new vision and the ability to provide infrastructure. It's just not the first thing that comes up in people's minds. We see this entire process of making decisions as being dynamic and fluid and not static. And I know that can be easy to say. It's actually very hard to try to do because you can have a development proposal that wants upzoning by a factor of 10 come out of nowhere. You can have an election and suddenly change course completely. So we try to take a look at our current land plan. You'll see that in the upper left portion of the screen. Estimate demand for future water based on that, and then start doing what we call bracketing analysis. And so the water resources folks will ask me, okay, I need a conservative estimate of what the current comp plan might allow at a build-out scenario, and then I need an aggressive scenario, and then something in the middle. And so in that way, we start looking at, okay, what happens if a 100-year drought occurs? What happens if a 500-year drought occurs? And we start to look at demand and supply projections for the overall water and see if there's a gap. And so obviously, if there's a surplus, generally people are okay with that. If there's a gap to the negative, meaning not enough water to accommodate what you're currently showing in your land use plan, that's when all of a sudden you start talking about changes in policy and what do we do about that scenario, so forth and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, as water becomes more and more expensive to buy, it will become the case where eventually over time we can't buy our way out of that situation, and that's becoming a more and more prevalent issue. So when I get together with the Director of Public Works and talk these issues through, we look at that top left thing, the land use plan, and say, okay, here's where we believe the development markets are going. Here's where we believe our city council and mayor are going. How does that affect our water supply plan? And effectively just run through this analysis as needed throughout the year, generally once a quarter, but as much as once a month, depending on what issues are coming up. Sometimes it can be twice a year. It just depends on how much growth pressure we're getting. I think most people in Colorado have now seen tremendous growth pressure over the last couple of years. So let's move to the next slide. So the next slide actually shows, and hopefully you can all read that. I know some of these boxes are a little bit small. So what happens when we actually start to see changes in the land use plan that affect the water supply plan? And so if you start on the left, you see the comprehensive water supply plan and the comprehensive land use plan being in the same sort of oblong bubble there. And then we start to look as you move left to right. So what happens if water demands become different than what's currently shown in the comp plan? If they're totally consistent with the comp plan, then we just monitor the situation and obviously we're done talking. If all of a sudden we see a change in the land use plan that creates a gap and there's a problem with overall water supply, we start to look at, okay, now what? Well, we've only been in this scenario in Westminster for the last 8 or 10 years where there's been tremendous growth pressure. And so we are not seeing a scenario where there's a surplus of water, but actually constant demands on our land use system that would indicate that over time there may be a deficit in total water supply. So we're spending most of our time moving through that box to what are we going to do about that? What are our city options? Do we allow developers to change the comprehensive plan, effectively upzone their property? If so, do we have to downzone somewhere else so the water supply plan remains constant? We're very concerned about a robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario, so we approve some development now. Generally, what we're really concerned about is approving incrementalist development now that stops us from achieving something we really want, like big development in our downtown or intense development around our transit station and those sorts of things. So the point of this slide would be, and I can get copies of any of this anybody wants, to constantly be looking at what is the relationship between your comprehensive plan and your zoning designations and the overall water supply plan. And because these things are fluid and dynamic and developers themselves can drive the dialogue because they want to propose new zoning or new development, it's really important that your technical folks and policy folks are talking about each of these discrete items, actions, so that you can then circle back and make sure you don't end up with a macro problem to either your comprehensive land use plan or whatever you call it from a vision standpoint for how you want your community to grow and or your ability to provide infrastructure. Let's move to the next slide. So what we do in Westminster, this is the city boundary sort of laid out across this map. Our total water supply plan anticipates more or less status quo for land that is already built. And then we have gone through areas of the city and assigned growth that we believe is going to happen and the city is going to approve over time. And then we build the water supply model based off of that. And that stems out of the policy dialogue that I continue to reference with the Public Works Director. So what we have, what you see in gray, is mostly status quo development. We're 93% built out. But then what you see circled, those are areas called focus areas in our comprehensive plan. And we have all of the policy language that John was referencing earlier relative to infrastructure provision identified and laid out in that chapter of the plan, anticipating significant growth over the next 20 years in those specific areas. And then the secondary part of that in the water supply plan, we look at areas of big new development. That's what you see in green on this map. And then parcels that we think are underutilized. And so though you might call that redevelopment, effectively what that is surface parking lots that could then go vertical in a significant way that would affect the water supply plan. So we then grow the overall water supply plan to account for this new development and then try to figure out how much total water we have from a ledger standpoint. The other thing that this type of analysis allows us to do is look at some implementing things, lift stations, gradients of the different piping technologies, et cetera, to see if we're going to be in need of a CIP budget down the road to accommodate this new growth through an operational standpoint. And we could talk about that too as we move away from the policy and into the implementation at the next webinar. Next slide. And so the big thing that I would leave just off this slide, and I'll be quick, is that without doing this kind of analysis and then tying it back to the city's comprehensive plan and or zoning ordinance, we can't absolutely say that we have enough infrastructure to accomplish the vision of the city. And I think as a planning director, that's actually a really important thing to be able to say. We have enough infrastructure to support the build out and growth to accommodate the vision of what our community wants 20 years down the road. And even a simple statement like that can go a long way to helping sell the idea that we need to grow in a very thoughtful way, not just because of vision, but also because of environmental stewardship and being good partners with our natural surroundings. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of slides with some data here. Our public works folks here are absolutely outstanding at tracking the amount of acre feet of water necessary per acre of development for the different categories of development that we have in the city. And so we track this over time. These are actually categories within our comprehensive plan. And so when we do the build out scenarios that I was mentioning earlier on a routine basis, we take an average usage in each category based on what we know is already built in each of those categories, and then apply it to the undeveloped land, the redevelopment areas, and the underutilized areas that I was showing on the map before. Go to the next slide. The other thing we spend a tremendous amount of time studying is outdoor water usage. One of the things that I've noticed about moving to Colorado 8 years ago, a number of the landscaping palettes, at least locally, tend to follow the Midwestern roots of the folks who moved out here originally. And many of those landscaping palettes actually require a tremendous amount of water. And so we'll talk more about landscape codes and adjustments to landscape codes that we have made and some of the best practices that we have found help keep certain types of species healthier at the next webinar. We track how much outdoor water usage is occurring in each of our comprehensive plan categories, again, tying back to the overall policy questions, so that we can then anticipate how much water we need for that. City of Westminster has a robust gray water system where we have reclaimed pipes in a large part of our city, but it's not entire city. And so we do use some potable water for outdoor landscape, particularly in the older parts of the city. Obviously, that has impacts on our ability to help facilitate other types of growth that are being contemplated in our zoning and comprehensive plan. Let's go to the next slide. So this shouldn't surprise anybody. The density of development drives water use. And so the more dense you get, you use less water per person, but obviously more acre feet of water per acre of total development. Again, not terribly surprising, but we have been studying that and have quite a bit of data on it. Let's go to what should be my last slide here. I want to put this one back up, and this is probably where I'll answer questions from here in a minute. I think that just having the opportunity to make sure that you are coordinating your vision and your policy documents with your infrastructure master planning and documents allows for tremendous good in government. So the opportunity to decide whether or not to upsize certain main trunk lines as a way to help spur reinvestment in an area and achieve city vision and get to where your land planners want to go, without having constant communication and dialogue, you just couldn't get there. You would have siloing occurring, and you would have land planners dreaming up visions, and you wouldn't have the implementation tools to get there. So from my standpoint, it really is the constant communication and coordination that allows for all of these good things that we talk about in terms of integrating land planning and water planning together to actually occur. So hopefully I've given you at least a couple of good things, nuts and bolts wise, from a policy standpoint on where those things can be located and how we've done it. I'm happy to get anybody copies of our comprehensive plan and the chapters that deal with this, and any of the graphics that we've shown here today if you're interested. So with that, Tiffany, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So feel free to, at this point, put your questions into the instant message. And then we'll receive those, and we can certainly ask both Mac and John your specific questions. We're assuming people are typing those questions up right now.
While that's coming up, I will just mention that anybody that's going to be at the state planning conference here in a couple of weeks, I will look forward to talking to you all about how you are dealing with some of these issues. Seeing the growth that we're seeing in Colorado is almost unprecedented outside of some other parts of the country, particularly near the coastline. Then this issue of coordinating water and land use is going to become a significant issue for our state moving forward. So looking forward to some of the dialogue. And I know some folks are giving presentations down there in Colorado Springs, so that'll be good.
So I just want to make sure that the last, Mac, do you see any questions coming in on the instant message?
I don't.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything on this computer. So, oh, there we go. Not a question, but a comment. So from Dan, which is great. We do have our third webinar, and I'll put up the slide in a minute, but we do have a third webinar, which Mac was referring to, where we'll be going into specifics regarding integration of another question coming in, of water conservation into the zoning code on November 4th. I'll put the information up. This is a change of date, so please note that. I'll put up that slide in a minute. So there is a question right now, a few coming in, asking, should we link water conservation goals with site planning? Can we put the site plans on a water budget that is consistent with the overall per capita per day goals for the community? Mac, do you want?
Yeah, I can answer that. And the answer is absolutely yes. Today we spent all of our time talking about where to put policy language in. I think that's very important because the question about site planning relates, in my mind, mostly to an implementation tool and technique. And so being able to tie whatever requirements you have, either through site plan requirements for more compact or more efficient water use development patterns or landscape code, should flow out of your policy documents. So we'll give you some more really good, I think, nuts and bolts on where that exists. In terms of language and zoning and code stuff at the next webinar. But yes, absolutely. The day-to-day decisions, if you're not careful, become incrementalists that add up to something bad down the road if you're not tracking them on each site plan approval.
Another just administrative detail here, because I know there's a question regarding it. We will send everybody both this PowerPoint presentation along with our email addresses and an evaluation link so that you have everything. The webinar is being recorded, and we will, at the end of the full series, be posting all of these webinars up online. And again, we'll be doing that at, after the whole series, and we'll send everybody a joint email saying that they are posted, where they're posted, and so that if you would like, you can show this to others. There's another question that just came in. Let me just digest it for a second. So I think, Mac, this is sort of talking about recent article in Headwaters magazine.
I don't see it. Oh, here we go. Okay, so there's a question here about, you know, is Westminster still in planning without implementation? I'm not familiar with the article that ran in Headwaters magazine, but I would say no, that's not the case. I think we're actually ahead of the curve. I'm always interested, as I mentioned, going to the planning conferences to find out where everybody else is or what they're doing for best management practices. But we've actually integrated quite a bit of implementation tools into both our landscape program, but also our inspections process, which I think is actually one of the most critical parts of all of this. We can draft all of the requirements we want, but if we don't know for sure it's happening out in the field, both before occupancy, but also post-occupancy, which is a really important thing from our standpoint, because everything might work on day 1, but on day 10, if it's spraying water all over the place or the internal water fixtures aren't working the way they're supposed to, you end up, you know, not budgeting correctly for the total amount of water usage. So, yeah, I think we actually have quite a bit going on. We may not be doing a good enough job putting ourselves out there. So thanks for the comment.
So there's a question, I don't know, again, I hate to put you on the spot, Mac, but about given the new concerns of marijuana growing facilities, do you know of any of the water requirements for those operations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do not off the top of my head, because we have exercised our rights under the constitutional amendment to not allow those facilities in Westminster. I am certain that we could probably communicate, you know, with some of the local counties and cities that are and try to get some answers to that, but I don't off the top of my head.
I just put the slide up for the next webinar, November 1st. It's changed from October 25th. So you see it up there. Again, we'll send you the meeting information for that. And if you need to contact someone, you know, right away or directly about anything, we do have an email up for you. Kevin Reedy, our partner, who's on the line right now from the state, is happy to direct any questions or other comments regarding the webinars. But again, we'll send you other of the presenters' emails for any other questions you might have.
Just to leave with a note of encouragement, when Tiffany and I were doing these training programs in the Front Range communities, it was amazing to see what happened when the water planners who we got together with the land use planners actually sat down at the table with one another and began to coordinate. It was rather inspirational and led to an awful lot of really good ideas and a lot of good initiatives. So for those of you who don't have, as Mac does, in-house water and land use planning, I really encourage you to get in touch with your water planners and your land use planners and begin to have this dialogue, because it's very effective, almost contagious.
So we're going to just stay on for a few more minutes in case there's any other questions. Maybe now that you know we're going to have our email addresses up, everyone's ready to post questions personally to us.
All right, I see Drew Beckwith put an answer out there to the marijuana question. Thanks, Drew.
All right, so I don't see many more questions coming in. I know we're wrapping up 2 minutes early here, but again, feel free to email any of us. We'll send along that information. Again, this is recorded, so we will post this online. And we look forward to hopefully hearing from many of you on November, or seeing some of you or hearing from you on November 1st. I did just get, not a question, a comment about saying something about urban growth boundaries as an effective way to achieve water conservation. Do you want to add anything to that before we sign off, John Nolan?
No, there was a lot of discussion about that, and it is in our checklist. It's very important. It sort of aligns with what I was saying about overlay districts and sort of the basics of smart growth, being able to determine where you want to grow, and that is in Colorado, of course, an intermunicipal issue. I know Denver Water has been very concerned about that, and Dr. Cog has been very concerned about that. There's not a lot of action on the ground that we can find there, but I think that's a really critical issue, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and I can speak to that too. I've been in Colorado for 8 years now. I've moved my way around the country, a couple other states. I think the issue of urban growth boundaries, having been through the UGB discussion with Dr. Cog, whenever that was, 7, 8 years ago, was really interesting. I was expecting more of a Portland or Oregon type approach to urban growth. Right now, a lot of the cities, as a result of their home rule authority, at least appear to want to exercise that home rule authority, which obviously has impacts on the concept of an urban growth boundary as the way to address this issue. I agree with John. It's absolutely one alternative that could be very powerful, but obviously there are other considerations as the cities try to figure out how to work through that collectively and together.
Okay. On that note, we will sign off. Again, we look forward to seeing you all again November 1st. That's just changed from the October 25th date. And thank you to both of our speakers, and I appreciate everyone attending. Always great. Thank you once more.